I found out my husband had another woman because a bartender congratulated them on winning the couple's trivia round before either noticed me standing 3 feet away. Garrett was laughing with Jocelyn, one hand against her back while coworkers joked that nobody coordinated schedules better than those two. I had driven 2 hours to surprise him because our 6th wedding anniversary fell that weekend. And for 1 second I thought I had entered the wrong room. Then Garrett looked up and stopped smiling. Nobody recognized me except him. Jocelyn lowered her hand but stayed beside him, while Garrett crossed the room, wearing an expression I knew. "Brooke, why didn't you tell me you were coming?" he murmured as managers turned away. I looked at Jocelyn's room key and answered, "Would that have changed what I just walked into?" His eyes moved toward her before returning to me. "This isn't what it looks like. Let me explain somewhere private," he urged, reaching for my elbow as though moving me could make the room forget. I stepped back, and Jocelyn approached. "I'm sorry you found out like this," she said, without sounding sorry enough to leave. Garrett cut her off. "Nobody here knows you're my wife. They're making assumptions because Jocelyn and I work together. So please don't make this worse." I looked at the unopened anniversary gift beneath my arm, then at the coworkers who had already treated them like a couple. The only assumption I made was that my husband wanted to spend our anniversary with me. The room went quiet. Garrett reached toward my wrist, expecting me to stay for another explanation, but his hand stopped when I moved away. "Give me tonight," he whispered. "I'll call tomorrow, and we'll fix this." Jocelyn remained near the entrance, making no move to leave. I turned toward the lobby with the gift unopened. Garrett followed and called my name, but I kept walking because every face behind him had given me the answer he was delaying. By the time the elevator doors closed, I had canceled the reservation. I knew I would never celebrate another anniversary with Garrett Dawson. I drove back to Portland before sunrise, with the anniversary gift unopened on the passenger seat. Garrett called 5 times before I reached home, then sent messages insisting the retreat had made everything look worse than it was. I packed 1 suitcase, left my wedding ring on the kitchen counter, and moved into an apartment across the river that afternoon. Another explanation could not change the room I had already walked into. The next morning, Garrett left a voicemail that sounded measured enough for anyone who had not seen Jocelyn beside him. "Give me one conversation before you make this permanent," he pleaded, but the confidence beneath his voice was still there. He believed a calm explanation would return me to the place he had left me. I deleted the message after listening once and changed my mailing address before lunch. 3 days later, something unrelated to our marriage began moving inside his company. The restaurant group activated a workforce analytics platform across every regional operation, a rollout scheduled months before our anniversary. Regional HR Director Olivia Grant sent a notice explaining that staffing patterns, scheduling decisions, promotions, turnover, and overtime would be compared during the reporting cycle. Nobody announced an investigation, and nobody mentioned Garrett or Jocelyn. Garrett assumed the silence meant our marriage was the only problem waiting for him. Jocelyn reassured several managers that the platform was another efficiency project and that no report could matter unless someone made a complaint. Neither understood that the system did not need suspicion. It only needed repeated decisions to reveal a pattern. While I met with my attorney and started the divorce process, the report moved through the company without my involvement. I never contacted Garrett's employer, described the retreat, or asked anyone to punish him. My decision belonged to the 6 years I had lived with him, and the moment I saw how completely he had separated that life from the one his coworkers knew. Everything else belonged entirely to choices Garrett and Jocelyn had already made. I was reviewing flooring samples with a client when Garrett's name flashed across my phone again, but I let it ring until the screen went dark. An hour later, Marcus Reed, a general manager I had met once at a company dinner years earlier, appeared in a local business article about employee retention. And that was the first time Garrett's company entered my world again, without Garrett being part of the conversation. The article mentioned that several regional locations had been selected for a workforce review after unusual scheduling trends surfaced in the new analytics platform. I read it once, closed the page, and returned to work. Inside Garrett's company, the review had already begun. Compliance analyst Elena Brooks started comparing shift assignments, promotion records, overtime distribution, and turnover across every restaurant in the region because the system had highlighted one operating group far outside normal patterns. Marcus was asked to explain why experienced employees kept leaving despite steady customer traffic, and he answered with the same calm consistency he had apparently maintained for months. The schedules never matched the performance reviews, he explained. The same people always received the best shifts, no matter who earned them. Those words were checked against the data instead of against anyone's opinion. Every scheduling adjustment left a timestamp. Every promotion carried an approval history, and every transfer request showed who accepted it or pushed it aside. Garrett reportedly insisted there had to be a technical error because regional managers regularly adjusted staffing to meet business needs. Jocelyn supported him, adding that flexibility was part of successful operations. But the records kept lining up in the same direction every time another report was opened. By the end of the week, the review was no longer about isolated scheduling decisions. Olivia Grant expanded the audit after the first findings matched Marcus's statements almost line for line, and Garrett was instructed to attend a formal compliance meeting the following week. I learned none of that from Garrett because he still called only to ask whether I was ready to talk. The strange part was realizing that while he kept trying to repair the marriage he had broken, another conversation had already begun somewhere else, built entirely from decisions he and Jocelyn had entered into the system long before I walked into that retreat. I was choosing lighting samples for a client when Garrett finally reached me from a number I did not recognize. I almost ended the call, but something in his voice stopped me for a moment. "This has gone too far," he said, without greeting me. "Corporate thinks I manipulated scheduling, and none of this would be happening if people stopped making assumptions." I answered quietly, "I haven't spoken to anyone from your company." And the silence that followed lasted longer than either of us expected. He exhaled hard before speaking again. "They're pulling months of records and acting like every decision means something. Jocelyn keeps telling them we were covering busy locations, but they won't listen." I looked through the window of my office at people walking past without any idea who Garrett Dawson was anymore, and replied, "You keep explaining the same thing to the wrong person." He tried one last time. "Brooke, you know how this business works." I ended the call because I no longer needed to understand how his business worked to understand how my marriage had ended. The compliance meeting arrived exactly as scheduled. Olivia Grant opened the session by explaining that the review had expanded because the first findings continued repeating across multiple restaurants instead of remaining isolated to one location. Garrett insisted the staffing model required flexibility, while Jocelyn argued that experienced employees naturally received stronger schedules, but Elena Brooks answered with a calm reminder that every adjustment had already been compared against performance scores, transfer requests, and manager approvals. Each new report supported the previous one instead of correcting it. When the meeting ended, nobody accused Garrett or Jocelyn of having an affair because that was never the question being examined. The discussion centered only on documented decisions that consistently favored the same employees despite conflicting performance records. Garrett walked out believing he could still explain everything before a final decision was made, while Jocelyn remained convinced the company would eventually realize the reports lacked context. Neither of them understood that the context had already been built into every approval they had entered over the previous months. Long before I ever stepped inside that hotel and watched coworkers congratulate them as a couple, I signed the first divorce papers on a gray Tuesday morning. And when I reached my car, Garrett's name was glowing on my phone. I let the call end because every conversation with him returned to the same unfinished defense, while my own decision had become clear enough to complete. That afternoon, his company moved from reviewing explanations to documenting conclusions. The audit had reached the point where intent mattered less than the pattern left behind. Olivia Grant scheduled a second compliance meeting after Elena Brooks confirmed the same scheduling imbalance across several restaurants. Her reports showed that preferred shifts, overtime, and internal promotions repeatedly went to the same small group, even when other employees carried stronger evaluations and longer service records. Garrett leaned forward and argued, "You're turning months of management decisions into numbers without context." Olivia answered, "The concern is not one decision. It is the same result appearing every time." Jocelyn tried to support him by insisting that experienced employees naturally earned more trust and better assignments. Elena opened another comparison, matching schedule changes against performance reviews, transfer requests, and approval histories, and the pattern remained unchanged. No one accused them of personal motives because the review did not depend on proving what they felt or why they acted. It only measured what their decisions had repeatedly done to everyone else. By the end of the meeting, Garrett and Jocelyn were removed from all scheduling and promotion authority while the company completed disciplinary recommendations. Garrett protested, "You're treating us like the decision is already made." But Olivia replied that the removal protected the review from interference. Jocelyn stopped defending the process and began questioning which approvals had come directly from Garrett. For the first time, they were no longer speaking as a united front. I learned about the leadership changes days later through an industry report. Not from Garrett. He left a voicemail asking whether we could start over because everything around him was unraveling at once. But he never mentioned Jocelyn or the employees whose schedules had been altered. I listened until the message ended, deleted it, and placed the signed papers inside the folder beside my desk. He still wanted one conversation to rescue him, while every record around him was answering back. Garrett called one evening just as I was locking my office. And this time I answered because I could hear something missing from his voice before he even spoke. He skipped every familiar apology and said, "Jocelyn told them the scheduling changes were my decisions. She says she only followed regional approvals." I leaned against my car without interrupting. After a long silence, I replied, "You're finally having the conversation you expected me to believe." He let out a tired breath that sounded older than the man I had married. "She promised we'd tell the same story," he admitted, then added, "Now she's saying I approved everything and she trusted my judgment." I remembered the hotel lounge where neither of them had stepped away from the other until I appeared. "The reports didn't change," I answered quietly. "The only thing changing is the person standing beside you." Inside the company, the final disciplinary review moved forward without either of them controlling it anymore. Olivia Grant met separately with Garrett and Jocelyn after comparing their explanations against the approval records already preserved in the system. Each tried to place responsibility higher or lower inside the management chain, but every version returned to the same documented approvals carrying their names. Nobody needed to decide who sounded more convincing because the records had been created long before either interview began. A few days later, the company announced its decision. Garrett was removed from his regional leadership position, and Jocelyn's employment ended the same day after the review concluded that both had repeatedly violated company standards governing staffing decisions. Marcus Reed assumed temporary operational oversight, while the restaurants reorganized under new leadership. The announcement contained no mention of my marriage, no mention of the retreat, and no mention of the affair that had started this chapter of my life. When Garrett called one final time, he did not ask me to come home. "I thought I could keep everything separate," he confessed, his voice almost disappearing before the last word. I looked at the signed divorce papers waiting on my dining table and answered with the only truth left between us. "You separated everything except the consequences." I ended the call, placed the phone face down, and realized I had finally reached a quiet that did not depend on anything Garrett chose to do next. The divorce hearing lasted less than 30 minutes because Garrett no longer challenged anything we had already signed. He looked exhausted in a way I had never seen during our marriage. Not angry. Not defensive. Simply worn down by weeks of answering questions in every direction. When the judge confirmed the final order, Garrett quietly wished me well before turning toward the hallway without waiting for my response. The man who once believed another conversation could repair everything finally walked away without asking for one. Outside the courthouse, I sat inside my car for several minutes before starting the engine. My phone stayed silent for the first time in months, and the absence of another missed call felt unfamiliar enough that I checked the screen twice anyway. I realized the waiting had disappeared with the marriage itself. Nothing remained unfinished between us anymore. A week later, I passed the restaurant Garrett used to visit after regional meetings. The parking lot looked exactly the same. Customers walked through the doors without recognizing the building had become part of someone else's ending. And I kept driving because I no longer needed proof that life continued without him. My own projects filled my calendar again. Clients discussed kitchens instead of court dates. And every ordinary conversation reminded me how much space constant disappointment had occupied. Peace returned quietly instead of announcing itself. One afternoon, Garrett sent a final email containing only one sentence. I finally understand that losing my job wasn't what ended everything. I read it once without searching for hidden meaning because he had already written the rest of that sentence through his own choices, long before he typed those words. I closed the message without replying and archived it beside the divorce paperwork. The strange part was never watching Garrett lose his position or seeing Jocelyn disappear from the company. The real ending arrived when I stopped measuring my future against the damage they had created and started noticing how little of my life still belonged to them. The hotel lounge, the compliance meetings, the reports, and the divorce all became parts of the same finished chapter instead of separate wounds. For the first time since our anniversary, I drove home without replaying a single conversation. And that quiet felt more honest than every promise Garrett Dawson had ever asked me to believe. Several months have passed since I carried that unopened anniversary gift out of the hotel and into a different life. The apartment I rented because I needed somewhere to breathe eventually became home, and my calendar filled with clients instead of difficult conversations. Sometimes I still remember the bartender congratulating Garrett and Jocelyn before either of them noticed me standing there. But the memory no longer asks me to change what happened. It simply reminds me where I finally stopped pretending everything was still intact. People occasionally ask whether I feel satisfied knowing Garrett lost both his marriage and his position. I always answer the same way. I didn't need his life to fall apart. I only needed mine to stop revolving around his choices. That became true the day I realized I had never contacted his employer, never asked anyone to investigate him, and never tried to control what happened after I walked away. The company reached its own conclusions because documented decisions kept repeating the same pattern. And our marriage ended because I finally accepted what I had already seen with my own eyes. Those two stories crossed at one moment, then continued toward separate endings without my help. Looking back, that may be the only reason I can remember every step without carrying the same weight I felt that night. If you're listening to this while wondering whether one conversation can erase what someone repeatedly chose to do, I hope you remember something I learned too late. Explanations can change words, but they cannot rewrite decisions that have already been made. The moment I stopped waiting for Garrett to become a different man was the moment I finally became free to build a different life for myself.